It's a pleasure and an honor to be here in front of this audience. I see it's made up with a large fraction of librarians. It's my first time here, although the American Institute of Physics knows this conference well. And you noted from my biography that I spent most of my career as a working physicist. And I have to tell you, one of my favorite persons was my librarian at MIT or Princeton or College of William & Mary, three institutions that I worked at. I loved the librarians. And I had to use them in the course of my research. I was an active author. I wrote a lot of papers in 30 years, a few monographs. I did a lot of reviewing. I did a lot of editing. I was an editor of several journals, but I have to confess that I didn't know much about the business side, even though I was a president of a small society and should have. So 6 years ago, I was given the honor of heading the American Institute of Physics, which is a science publisher, as many of you know. And I'd rapidly learned the business side. And I was dismayed that after 3.5 centuries of librarians and publishers working well together for this decade now, we've been distracted by this and polarized by this open access debate. And like Phil, I would like it just to go away and for his dog to put his teeth away, and we get on with being librarians and publishers. And I think we're making progress, and perhaps by a few more of these conferences, we can put it behind us. So what I want to talk about is, as Phil mentioned, give you the landscape of where the public access debate is evolving in the US. And like almost everyone in this audience, both librarians and publishers and the research community, we want access. The last thing we want to do is write something and have nobody read it. Right? It occasionally happens if I look at the citations in my own journal articles. I know my mother read them. What I have been trying to work on with my colleagues, and I'm pleased to see that two of my colleagues on a proto-Finch group, the Scholarly Publishing Roundtable, are in the audience. I see Mark Patterson back there, and Scott Pluchek is in the audience also. We're trying to identify a path forward that is pragmatic for all parties, and it involves all parties in developing the solution. So I want to work through this evolution and make comments on 3 stopping points along the way. One was some of the principles we identified in the Scholarly Publishing Roundtable, which met in 2009 and presented our report in early 2010. And I'm happy to say a lot of that ended up in legislation in the US, the American Competes Reauthorization Act of 2010, more fondly known as the Competes Act. And this has led finally to a directive to the US science agencies that was just posted in February by the President's Science Advisor Office. And in the intervening time of the Competes Act and this directive, there has been some interesting activities where agencies and stakeholders are talking about moving forward. And I'll give you some highlights of what we like to call as partnership solutions. So first, a little capsule summary of the evolving debate over public access in the US. You're probably all familiar with the negotiations between the publishing community and the largest basic science funding agency in the world, the National Institutes of Health, that runs PubMed Central. It's a wonderful site for librarians and researchers. But I have to remind you, the National Institutes of Health, given its size, funds more research than all the other basic research agencies in the US combined. You know, its library operation is something over $650 million. So they should be able to produce a marvelous product. I'm not telling anyone in this audience anything different with my first statement there, that the negotiations between NIH and the publishers was contentious. And it led to a very simple one-paragraph mandate in an appropriations bill in 2007 that made the public access mandate mandatory 5 years ago, today actually, April 8th, 2008. It was a very fundamental change in how public access was dealt with. It ignited green on a 12-month embargo for the fast-moving field of biomedicine. And it's fair to say it has probably largely worked, and it really hasn't hurt the publishers except for download statistics going to PMC as opposed to their site. It led to some dueling legislation, which I won't talk about. It's forgettable. But it did lead to the formation of the Scholarly Publishing Roundtable, which wasn't quite as representative as the Finch Group, but it did include publishers, both nonprofit and profit, librarians, and our chief academic officers in the US system. They're called provosts. And you librarians know in the US what a provost does. He or she controls your budget, and you have chancellors here in the UK that do the same thing. So it's important that these people be represented. That group met for 6 months, largely shielded from having to give a report to the nightly news every night. We wrote our report and made it public after 6 months of deliberations. And a year later, most of our recommendations ended up in legislation in the America Competes Act. That was signed by President Obama in January of 2011, and it put into process a series of activities that are continuing this day, largely led by the President's Science Advisor Office, OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which immediately set up two subcommittees in early 2011. One subcommittee having to do with developing public access for scholarly publications, another subcommittee dealing with public access for data. In the legislative language in the Competes Act, I'm going to highlight a few things. It asked the stakeholders, everyone who had something to say about this, to try to continue the roundtable process, work together and work out some solutions. It also asked for an array of public comment. The OSTP put out what was called a request for information, an RFI. A lot of that information was largely collected. It was posted, and I don't know how useful that process was, other than allowed a lot of people to vent. Okay. Probably one of the most important agencies in the US for basic science funding after NIH is the National Science Foundation. They have a citizens advisory board called the National Science Board. It hasn't done too much on publications yet, but it did get hard at work on data, and they released a report. Legislation did come out at the end of the year called the Research Work Act. It was short-lived because it lost traction very quickly, but it did unleash what I think was a terrible backlash and was not a very helpful piece of legislation. Similar legislation was introduced on the open access front, which would essentially just extend the NIH mandate across the other 11 science agencies in the US that at least fund $100 million worth of research annually. Most of you probably know this legislation by name. It's called FERPA, Federal Research Public Access Act. It's been introduced in almost every session of Congress in the last 5 years. Meanwhile, the original group that set up the roundtable, which was the House Science Committee, did a checkup about a year ago. They held a hearing, and I'll mention that. And OSDP, which was hard at work with these two committees, released an interim report. It was a marvel of non-content. It was 45 pages long. It had about 2 pages of real content that says, yes, we're working on it. The partnership activities, which were unleashed by the Competes Act, though, did continue. And one I'll mention this morning was recently completed thanks to the coordination of Crossref, which actually produces a very fundamental piece of information for public access. What funding agency funded an article? That's actually a very hard piece of information to find because it's buried in an article, sometimes an acknowledgement, sometimes in a footnote. And if you've had a chance to go to Crossref and look up their FundRef initiative, you'll see that this problem is on the way towards a solution. And then, of course, last June, we just heard the Finch report. Finch Group released its report, and we heard an excellent summary of where the situation is. So we launch into this year. In February, OSTP put out a very simple directive. I'll give you a few comments on that. It was only a 6-page document. It relaunched the same 2 working groups using, again, the agencies that fund at least $100 million in the US. That's 11 agencies. And I'll tell you that in the 6 pages, it directs these agencies to produce a plan for public access of scholarly publications and data 5 months from now. That's a lot of work to be done. So I'll cycle back to these 3 touch points: the Competes Act, then the OSTP directive, then partnerships. So the Competes Act had some very useful language in there. It noted that anything done in this area ought to serve the public interest. It ought to take advantage of the fact that the US is a big player here, but there are very interesting things happening, particularly here in the UK and EU. And anything to be done in the US ought to take this international context in mind. It asks for flexibility, some of the things we just talked about in the Q&A session. There are differences between well-funded hard sciences and niche fields and the humanities in terms of the ability to deal with author processing charges, for example. My most favorite sentence in this law is the one I've highlighted in the first bullet there. It asked the working groups to solicit input and recommendations from and collaborate with non-federal stakeholders and list them by name. Okay? The public, universities, nonprofit and for-profit publishers, and libraries are all listed by name. And finally, it noted that there is a difference between dealing with publications and data. They're all products of publicly funded research, including the gray literature up front, the intermediaries of data, and of course, the crowning jewel, peer-reviewed publications. So Congress was checking up on this process just a year ago in this hearing, and I'm happy to tell you that this hearing was bookended by myself and my colleague Scott Pluchek, who will bookend this conference by giving the last plenary talk. And I use the word bookends because that lets you know that somebody's on one side and somebody's on the other side, but our roundtable experience taught both Scott and I to work toward the middle. You'll hear that if you look at this testimony. It's on the web, it's on YouTube, and if you want a several page summary, if you go to a little column that we write in American Institute of Physics called FYI 3 times a week, you'll see a nice summary of that. So what the Competes Act and this checkup a year ago did was urge the stakeholders to move from legislation to working directly with the agencies. And why is that? Well, if you've been following the US political scene, you'll see that legislation is difficult to enact, and lately it's been almost impossible. The US Senate produced its first budget in 4 years just a few weeks ago. And then if you are successful in getting legislation enacted, if you happen to make a mistake because of unintended consequences, it's very difficult to undo. Whereas working with agencies are a very different kind of thing. And this agency-level involvement was encouraged. Now, why is it very different? Well, it's the science agencies that fund the science. They have an extraordinary track record, for the most part, of consulting with the scientific communities. They often have citizen science advisory committees, particularly the 2 agencies I'm most familiar with because they provided my research funding in my career, Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation, have very important citizen science advisory committees that deal with funding priorities and political issues like public access. And they really benefit from these sort of partnering activities. And most importantly, when any real activity has to be dealt with, it's the funding agencies who have the money. It works the same way here in the UK. What the President's Science Advisor's Office did a month ago in publishing this 6-page directive was make it very clear that it's time for the agencies to move forward and develop and post a plan for providing access to some form of text of a scholarly publication as quickly as possible, and to deal with the associated data. They have less than 5 months to produce these plans, and the agencies will probably have about a year to implement them. And I note that it's going to apply for publications and data from the starting point that the plans are relevant, although you will probably see a lot of backdating into the archives by publishers. So it's a very sophisticated memo, even though it's only 6 pages long. And like the Finch Commission, it noted that despite the anger that some of you have with dealing with publishers, that publishers do provide an essential service by maintaining this independent, high-quality peer review, and it becomes the basis that almost every research institution judges the value of a scholar. On the usual controversial point of dealing with green open access as a means of sustaining publications, the word 12 months was used as a guideline. And it asked for some form of flexibility by field or by niche publications. Of course, how you actually instill flexibility in this is one of the problems that both the Finch group and the Roundtable dealt with. And most importantly, it encouraged the use of partnerships with publishers that have been started as a result of the Roundtable and Competes process to continue developing initiatives that might be encapsulated in the in the plans that we will see come to light in 5 months from now. There were several other important elements of this brief memo. It noted that there is no new money for any public access plan, that whatever was recommended and implemented had to be done with existing resources, and it urged the agencies not to duplicate existing resources that might be available anywhere in the private sector, in the realm of publishers, research institutions, libraries. And it was particularly concerned with instilling the use of partnerships because of the particular advantage that might allow for one particular stakeholder to provide resources to solve a problem that they're used to solving. Data is a very different story. I won't spend any time on that. I think it's far less emotional than the scholarly publication issue, because for the most part, there's no argument that data that results from publicly funded research should be made public. There are issues of formats, and there are issues of proprietariness for commercial applications or security applications. It will just have to be worked through, and a separate committee is working on that. It's interesting to note that when this memorandum was posted on February 22nd, there were reactions that came out rather quickly that, unlike previous pronouncements from some arm of the US government, the announcements from all sides were generally very positive. The National Science Foundation produced a memo that was co-signed by 5 other agencies that basically applauded the memorandum and basically said, we'll get to work on it. One of the organizations that I serve on the board, the Professional Scholarly Publishing Division of the American Association of Publishers, put out a very supportive statement, and I'm pleased to see that the SPARC organization associated with the Association of Research Libraries also put out a positive statement. So it was a distinct change in tone from all sides. Now, why I tend to be optimistic about going forward and hope we can bring the discussions about open access from a debate to more of an implementation side is because of the experience that I've had since the roundtable with initiating and beginning to work on some agency publisher partnerships. And I want to mention several of them, the most important being the fundamental issue of just identifying the funding agency associated with an article, this FundRef initiative. I'll mention another one that has to do with interoperability. When my colleagues in the scholarly roundtable got together to talk about access, we realized that was only one part of the problem we were asked to look at. Interoperability between the world's information that is on government platforms and private platforms was closely associated to access. So was linking to data, and so was dealing with the archiving and preservation of digital content. Identifying, persistent identifiers for both publicly funded work and associated data, and an author's identity. We're going to hear later in this conference about ORCID, also very important. And some associated solutions in the US have come about having to do with providing access at public libraries. I know that was mentioned by the Finch group, and an interesting article rental model. And I'd like to close with saying that the publisher's response to the OSTP directive, building on this publishing partnership, is well in play, but I can't give you any details yet. Perhaps at your next conference we can give you a progress report. So I had already told you why interacting with these agencies are a very important thing to do. We chose two in particular to concentrate on as an ad hoc group of publishers, primarily because they each fund almost $5 billion worth of research, National Science Foundation and Department of Energy. And we proposed to them 2 years ago opening up discussions on developing pilot projects in several areas: standards, persistent identifiers, discovery tools, and some pilot projects on access and cross-linking the government platforms with private platforms. The first project that we talked about has actually come to fruition. It began just a year ago. It was launched by Crossref as a facilitator. It included a group of publishers and a group of funding agencies that would solve the fundamental starting problem of just identifying the funding agency associated with an article. And we should have solved this problem long ago, and the publishing community is on the front line of this because we collect that manuscript from the start of the process, collect the standard metadata on the author's name, his or her institution, assign a digital object identifier through Crossref. That is the starting point for collecting the funding agency. And the FundRef project was begun just a year ago with this pilot involving the 7 publishers you see up there, 3 US funding agencies, the 2 I mentioned, Department of Energy and NASA, and then the Wellcome Trust was represented. And the pilot was just completed last month. The project was approved by the Crossref board, and there'll be a formal launch of this initiative by Crossref next month. And we're very hopeful that this will be, we will start collecting this metadata for the start of the next subscription year. And this will be rolled out to most of the software houses that are involved with the software on starting up the author submission process. I must say this project was given a huge head start by Elsevier, one of the participating publishers, who donated 2 years of data mining on the Scopus database, so that what an author will find on their input screen is a pull-down menu that has funding agency names, some 4,000 different names, and for some of the larger agencies, it's faceted by grant numbers. A second pilot project involved DOE, took a start at the interoperability problems. I mentioned gray literature as being one facet of a research result. Research reports. Every grantee has to write a research report. Try to find them. Through the 11 US agencies, 12 if I count NIH, for the most part they do a terrible job of posting these research reports. And there's a one-to-one correspondence between the report and a research grant. And not all those grants result in publications, so it's a missing element here. Department of Energy is one of the standouts. On their website, science.gov, they have over 300,000 research reports posted. So a group of 5 publishers have started a pilot that will link research reports on the Department of Energy platform to follow-on publications on the publisher's platform. That, again, is a very nice access demonstration because people can come into either the public site or the publisher's site and go both directions. And you can't see this slide, but it'll be posted. For Department of Energy, if you take about 8 publishers, you have 90% of their content, of their funded content. So we are involving those publishers in this pilot, and they're listed there. The last pilot I want to tell you about is a cross-connect between the public access to publication problem and the public access to data problem. What's the most valuable data in the world? It's the data that was included in a scholarly publication. Often that data is sitting buried in a notebook or on a thumb drive, and it disappears with the graduate student. So NSF has funded a pilot project involving American Institute of Physics and the American Astronomical Society to look at author attitudes for linking data to publications, that important subset of data that lies behind a figure or a photograph or a table. And we started this project by surveying authors to look at their attitudes for doing this very important thing. We'll have results from these surveys out this summer. We'll hear later in this conference from Laurie Hock, the executive director of ORCID, about how much progress this new public-private initiative is making towards solving the author ID and the institutional ID problem. You combine this with FundRef, and then we have a very fundamental starting point for identifying and tracking publicly funded articles. And I mentioned in the Finch deliberations, there was a discussion of making all articles available in public libraries. One of the American publishers, a member of the American Institute of Physics, the American Physical Society, launched an initiative 2 years ago that includes a very simple web-driven interface from a public library. And they have over 600 libraries in the US now participating in this very interesting initiative, and they've extended it to high schools. And one other access initiative that I'll end on is basically a follow-up of an iTunes model using a company called Deep Dive that now involves 100 publishers. If you go to American Institute of Physics website and you happen not to have a subscription, you can find a little tab that says Rent Me, and you can rent an article for a period of time for a modest cost. And I did this as an experiment just to see how many people beyond our subscription website and paywall couldn't find our articles. We have about 1.5 million people visit our website every month, largely from the 1,000 institutions like yourselves that subscribe to our content. And in a year, 3,000 people asked to rent an article for the price of a cup of coffee. And I'm glad they did, but to me, that was a very interesting piece of data. So I thank you for your attention. I look forward to spending the rest of the conference with you, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Conchita, any burning questions for Fred? Just quick. Yes, there's one on the front row there behind you, Brian. Okay.
The US ISSN Center at the Library of Congress. This is a side issue, I suspect, but one that within the ISSN network, we've been very concerned about the seeming explosion of startup open access publishers who are asking for as many as 100 or 200 ISSN at a time for journals that have titles remarkably similar to already existing journals and who solicit authors. I get solicitations for writing articles in high energy physics, and I'm a librarian. So any comments about whether this is hurting the open access brand?
I think it's hurting all of us in the enterprise. And I think we should be applying public pressure to stamp out that entity. And so I get the same solicitations as the head of a publishing house. My editors, who are well taken care of, I support 140 editors across the world buying down their teaching time, get the same solicitations to be editors of these things. So I think we, as a group, we need to apply very public pressure to stamp that entity out of existence. Even your little speech becoming public in this forum helps. Thank you very much.
Okay. On that